Welcome to the Commonwealth Policy Center special, and we've got a real treat today. With me in the studio is 1st District Congressman James Comer. This is the week when he's been in office for 1 full year, and we're going to hear more about him and what's been happening in Washington, D.C. Congressman Comer, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, hey, it's great for you to take some time out of your busy schedule. I know that you've been traveling the district, and you were just in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and with the president. One of the questions that comes to mind, you were on the set almost a year ago,
right.
And when you were running for office, we did a kind of a primary forum. The question that I have is Washington, D.C. and serving in Congress all that you expected? Were you planning on it being the way it was? I mean, you've been in office before.
Right.
You knew something about politics, and campaigning on the, for that office was one thing.
Right.
But then getting up to Washington, D.C., especially in the political climate that we're in, did you anticipate what you were getting into, or was it a little different, or maybe not?
Well, that's a great question. I get asked that a lot, and I think most people know I was in the Kentucky State House of Representatives for 11 years. Now I'm in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, and it's very different in Washington. For example, in Frankfort, there were issues that were partisan, that the Republicans and Democrats party line voted on. But in Washington, there's what I call hyper-partisanship. I cannot think of a single major piece of legislation in the 12 months I've been in office that I voted on that a single Democrat voted with the Republicans on. And that's unfortunate. That creates a toxic environment. The media coverage is very different in Washington. It's just constantly trying to have those gotcha moments with the members of Congress, and I think that creates a toxic environment. Obviously, when I started, it was at the tail end of the Obama administration during the lame duck session, and now I've gotten to serve under the Trump administration. So to go from Obama's ideology to Donald Trump's ideology, there's been a big learning curve for a lot of members of Congress, all the Democrats and unfortunately some of the Republicans. So it's been a shock to me to see, first of all, the level of hyper-partisanship, and then it's been a shock to see how long it takes to get a bill passed. When I was in Frankfort, we could get a bill passed pretty quickly. And you saw in this legislative session in Frankfort, they got a lot of major pieces of legislation done in 1 week. The way the process is set up, especially in the United States Senate, it takes months and months and months, because for a bill to become law, it has to pass the House and the Senate. So those are the biggest shocks that I've had, the length of time it takes to get something through the process and the hyper-partisanship.
For me, if I was in your shoes, and I'm not, but to work for principle, to work for certain values, when you're in that context of hyper-partisanship, Republican, Democrat, instead of looking at things from the right and wrong, what's good for the American people, what is the right thing to do, it would be very difficult for me to navigate that, and I'm sure you've learned, as you said, there's a big learning curve, but how do you do that when, I know that there are certain things that you went up there to do, but
right.
Is there any room, I'm curious, for fighting for principle in Congress?
I think so, and there are a lot of good members of Congress. We see on TV, usually the bad ones that are in trouble or make a bad statement or whatever. The overwhelming majority of people that I've gotten to know fairly well in Congress, I think are good people that have strong opinions, strong, consistent ideologies. Unfortunately, many of them, especially from the New England area and the Pacific West, their ideologies are vastly different than ours. Even the Republicans, they're very liberal on social issues. But I believe that most people go to Congress really wanting to make a difference, and for the most part they try to make a difference and try to abide by their values. It's just the opinions of the 435 members of the House of Representatives are like fingerprints. There's no two alike, unfortunately. And it's very difficult to get a majority to agree on an issue. And just changing from 8 years of Obama and the liberal social policy, the liberal economic policies, to Donald Trump, which is much more conservative and something that I like. I agree with his conservative ideology. So I believe that's made it a little more difficult for some of the more liberal and moderate members to kind of make that adjustment. But I believe, and I'm hopeful that we can make a difference, and especially those of us who are conservatives, that we can try to get a more conservative agenda through the United States Congress.
The perception of Congress right now, Congressman Comer, is that nothing is getting done. What is the truth? I've heard you speak on this before, but what are you seeing up there?
Well, when I hear people say Congress is dysfunctional, I say I agree with that, but I wish they would be a little more specific. The definition of Congress is the House and the Senate. As I said earlier, for a bill to become a law in Washington, it's just like it is in Frankfurt, it has to pass the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. So if you look at the United States House of Representatives, where I am, there are 435 U.S. representatives. We've passed all of President Trump's agenda. We passed a bill to repeal and replace Obamacare. We passed a bill to fund the southern border wall that's so controversial that the president wants. We've passed a bill to repeal Dodd-Frank. But in every case, when those bills went to the Senate, they couldn't get to 50. Everybody remembers the health care bill when McCain went and did the thumbs down. That's pretty much what's happened with all the bills. So I agree that Congress is dysfunctional, but the biggest problem right now is in the U.S. Senate.
So you're doing what you said you would do, at least in the House side. The Senate's not doing their job. How do you translate this to the people in your district? And by the way, I know that one of your promises was to visit every county in Kentucky. And this week you've done that, all but one, your home county you're going to be at today.
We're having the town hall in my home county. So I have 35 counties in the 1st District, 6 hours from east to west. It's a very spread out rural district. I made the promise during the campaign that I'd have a town hall, invite the public. We don't turn anyone away. We have people that come in with resist t-shirts that we know are going to be disruptive, but we let them come in and ask questions. So I've done that in all 35 counties.
So what are you hearing back in these town hall meetings that you're having? You're telling them, here's what we've done, this is what we promised to do. Are they hearing that? Are they understanding the gridlock between the House and the Senate and the challenges there?
I think once I explain it, it resonates, but people are used to seeing, whether they watch Fox News or MSNBC or ABC or CBS, the one consistent message is Congress is dysfunctional. This Congress hasn't achieved a whole lot, which I agree with. But I explained the process that the House of Representatives is supportive of the president's agenda. We have passed the president's agenda. It's the Senate where we've fallen short. I'm hopeful that this tax reform, this tax cut package that I voted on this week in Washington, hopefully it will pass the Senate. And I feel like that's going to be the first major piece of legislation that's going to make it through both the House and the Senate.
We're going to talk about that tax cut package that you passed, but we're going to take a break and we'll be back in just a minute.
Great.
Thank you.
At the Commonwealth Policy Foundation, we try to approach the issues of life, marriage, religious liberty, and fiscal integrity from a biblical perspective that promotes thoughtfulness and kindness. We work with political leaders and concerned citizens from all across the state. To stay informed, visit CommonwealthMatters.org and sign up for our e-newsletter. The Commonwealth Policy Foundation is a nonprofit organization that only exists because of friends like you. Thanks for tuning in to the Commonwealth Matters.
Welcome back. Hey, just before the break, we were talking with Congressman James Comer about the recently passed tax cut in Congress, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about this from your perspective, because what I've heard from the media hasn't been favorable. Now, it depends what news media you're tuned into, but one of the things I've heard is that this tax cut will favor top corporations and top wage earners in the country. Tell us who it does favor and who it helps.
It helps everyone. It helps everyone that's working. If you look at my district, one thing that's unique about my district compared to a lot of other districts, especially Republican districts, I have a poorer district. So I'm mindful of the fact that I don't want to pass any type of legislation that only benefits the wealthiest individuals. I'm focused on working class Kentuckians, because that's what comprised the 1st Congressional District. And 80% of the people in my congressional district do not itemize their taxes. Wow. They go in and go into H&R Block or wherever, lay down their W-2 and take the standard deduction. Right now, the standard deduction is $12,000. We doubled the standard deduction to $24,000. So if you make $28,000 a year, if you work at a factory, you make $28,000 a year. Today, you're paying taxes on $16,000. With this bill, you're only going to be paying taxes on $4,000. Okay. So it's a significant pay cut. That's for people that are hourly workers all the way up to small business owners. We are cutting the corporate tax rate. The goal there is to try to have a more competitive tax rate compared to the industrialized nations. Right now, the United States has one of the highest tax rates in all of the industrialized world. One of the things that President campaigned on was to try to bring those jobs back, the jobs that we lost during NAFTA, bring those jobs back to America. To do that, we have to lower the corporate tax rate, because one reason a lot of those factories left and went to places in Asia and places in South America, Central America, is because they have a lower corporate tax rate there. So this is all part of a plan to try to put America first, to try to get good paying manufacturing jobs back. I've always said this, if you look at a lot of the problems that we have in America, they revolve around poverty. If we want to get people out of poverty, the best way to get people out of poverty is to create an environment where those people living in poverty have access to a good paying job. To do that, we have to improve the business climate, and that's what this tax cuts bill will do. But it also focuses on middle class people, small business owners, family farmers. So if you're working in a factory and our bill passes the Senate and the president signs it into law, then once it's signed into law, when you get your paycheck on Friday, you're going to have more money in your paycheck because they're going to be taking less federal withholding taxes.
So you'd mentioned that the average income in the 1st Congressional District is about $28,000. Right. So practically speaking, if that tax cut passes and if that standard deduction is brought up to about $24,000, right, how much could the average wage earner in the 1st District expect to keep in their own pockets?
I think it's going to save anywhere from $800 to $1,200 per person for the average worker in the 1st District. If you look at the percentage of what they pay in taxes, that's a significant percentage of what they pay in taxes. Yeah. What the news media is focused on is, if you have a very wealthy business owner like Donald Trump, they're going to be saving millions of dollars, but this person over here is only going to be saving hundreds of dollars. Well, the guy that makes millions of dollars is paying significantly more in taxes already. So it cuts taxes for everyone. Sure. And that's why I was supportive of it.
So one of the goals in this tax reform was to simplify the tax code. There's thousands of pages, I think, in the tax. I mean, if you're to have a book, it's pretty significant. So they looked at simplifying. One of the controversial measures that was debated the other week was to take away the adoption tax credit. And have you heard from your constituents on this?
We did, and that was one of the biggest surprises that I had when I was elected to Congress. I knew that we have a lot of great families that adopt children from other countries and adopt children from here in America, but I didn't know how many, because one of our biggest services that we provide in my office is casework for constituents. And one of the biggest requests we get are issues people are having with getting foreign adoptions back to the United States. It's getting harder for some of the countries to get the kids back to their families here in America. So I realized real quickly how many people were adopting. And I know that adoption tax credit was very important for those families that are doing the right thing and adopting children and bringing them into loving families. So I was part of a group that tried to get that credit back in. The reason it was taken out initially was because, as you mentioned earlier, the goal was to simplify the tax code, to get rid of all these tax credits, most of which aren't like the adoption tax credit. They're for tax credits for special interest. So we wanted to take all those out, make it simpler, and reduce the tax rate. There was overwhelming concern from conservative families all over America that are adopting children, and it's a big financial struggle and financial strain to adopt. So we got that tax credit put back in the House version. I'm pretty confident it's going to stay in the Senate version as well.
So were you still able, and I appreciate that personally, by the way, I think that is good policy to encourage adoption and to make it easier for people in the district and across the country, quite frankly, to adopt.
Right.
Overall, though, was the goal of simplifying the tax code, was that achieved? Were there some significant things that were taken out as deductions in that bill? And I know it was a large bill, and there was a lot in it, but do you recall anything that actually did simplify and maybe take out some deductions?
A lot of tax credits were taken out. There were some that were put back in. The one that got the most attention, because most of the major news networks are based out of New York, was what's called the SALT, the state and local tax deduction. You can deduct your state taxes on your federal income tax, the state taxes that you pay. That was one of the things that was taken off. But remember, we're reducing the rate by 50%, increasing the standard deduction by 50%. So a lot of people that have sent messages to my social media fussed, well, I'm not going to get a write-off my state income tax, but your rate is being reduced by 50%. You're going to pay less taxes with this plan than if we did nothing. And obviously the homeowners were concerned with some of the things. States like New York that have higher income taxes, this was a bigger deal for them. So there were a lot of tax credits that were taken out, but I'm glad to say the adoption tax credit was kept in there.
Good. Another criticism about tax reform is that when you cut taxes, you're also accused of adding to the deficit and to the national debt, because you theoretically won't be taking as much money in. Now that's a debate in itself. Do you take in more revenue when you cut taxes, and it spurs business, it spurs investment, and when people put more money in their own pockets, then they're likely to make more purchases and to do something with it. But how do you address that issue of, well, it's just going to contribute to the national debt, which, by the way, we're looking at $20 trillion, which is significant.
Exactly. And that's a big concern of mine. I agree with that criticism. That's one of the criticisms that I think is 100% valid of this tax bill. I wanted to couple the tax cuts with spending cuts. Unfortunately, I was in the minority in Congress, even among the conservative Republicans. They may campaign and say they want to make cuts, but when it comes time to actually cutting, it for whatever reason becomes harder for them to do that. So what I've settled on, and many of the, I guess you could call deficit hawks in Congress, what we've settled on, all right, we're going to cut taxes and we're going to see how much more revenue it brings in. I personally don't think it'll be enough to balance the deficit. So next year we're going to do everything in our ability to try to convince a majority of members of Congress to cut, because we can't continue to run that federal budget debt up from $20 trillion. We criticized Obama and the Democrat Congress for running the debt up so much. And here it's the Republicans' time to govern. And if we run the debt up at the same levels that Obama did, then shame on us. And I think that's a valid concern. I did give a floor speech, and it's on our social media site and our website, where I said my one concern about this tax cut bill is the deficit. I'm going to do everything in my ability next year when we see what type of economic growth we're having. If we have 5% economic growth, then it will balance out. But that's unprecedented to have that much growth. Our economy's growing much faster today than it was when Obama was president, simply because there's a sense of confidence restored in the private sector from a new president. So I'm going to continue to fight for budget cuts to try to balance the budget.
Thank you, Congressman Comer. I want to come back after this break and talk a little bit more about some things that can be reduced, some things that can be cut from the federal government. So stick with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
At the Commonwealth Policy Foundation, we try to approach the issues of life, marriage, religious liberty, and fiscal integrity from a biblical perspective that promotes thoughtfulness and kindness. We work with political leaders and concerned citizens from all across the state. To stay informed, visit CommonwealthMatters.org and sign up for our e-newsletter. The Commonwealth Policy Foundation is a nonprofit organization that only exists because of friends like you. Thanks for tuning in to the Commonwealth Matters.
Welcome back. With me on the studio set is Congressman James Comer. And Congressman, just before the break, we were talking about tax reform and a major bill that you just passed that does reduce taxes for the average person in the 1st Congressional District. What I'd like to get to is cutting government. There's really not a whole lot of talk about cutting. We have a very, very large federal government. What are some areas that could be cut?
Well, I voted for an amendment that Marsha Blackburn, the congresswoman from just below us in Tennessee, she's filed apparently every year for the last 7 or 8 years, that just does a 1% across-the-board cut in every cabinet, 1%. And there are 435 members of Congress, 240 Republicans. I was one of 100 that voted for that bill, for that amendment. So you could do a 1% across-the-board cut. I would vote for 2 or 3% across-the-board cut. I'm familiar with the Department of Agriculture because I was Kentucky Commissioner of Agriculture for 4 years. There's so many programs within the USDA that could be cut. I'm a big proponent of cutting welfare. We have companies that are trying to hire people today in every county in my district, but they're competing against the government because it's more advantageous for a lot of people to stay at home and not work than it is to go to work. So we have to cut welfare. We have to cut across the board. The federal government's bloated, and I will continue to fight for budget cuts.
It sounds cruel, or at least it's been caricatured as being cruel when you say cut welfare. There are some people who do need that safety net, and there are some people who are probably gaming the system. We did hear on the news just recently where Governor Bevin's Medicaid waiver has gone through, and one of his proposals has been to have a work requirement or a volunteer requirement. If you're receiving Medicaid, this is state assistance for medical needs, if you're poor and don't have insurance, and that is going through, where he's going to have some stipulations on work or volunteering. In general, would you think that's a good idea for those who are receiving welfare if they're able-bodied, if they're of working age? Is that something that should be done?
Absolutely, and that's one reason I voted for the Health Care Act several months ago to replace Obamacare. One of the stipulations in that bill was it would allow states to apply for waivers to put work requirements for Medicaid recipients. So if you're able-bodied, if you look like me, and you're a man and you're at home and you don't have any dependent children in the house, you should be working. And what the governor's applied for is something that I strongly support. It would put work requirements on able-bodied men that are receiving welfare.
Okay, so even if you have, let's say, a bad back, but if you're able to type or maybe do some office work, you would suggest that they would.
There's so many jobs that are available out there, and there's so many businesses that are mindful of, we'll hire people even if they're in a wheelchair or whatever. So the state can easily have a database of physicians if you have a bad back or whatever. I believe in limited government. I believe it's government's responsibility to help people that can help themselves. But we have a state in Kentucky now where over 30% of the state is on Medicaid. In Tennessee, that's 11%. So we've got a third of the state that's essentially not in the workforce. And that's holding Kentucky back. That's putting a drain on everything in Kentucky, our roads, our schools, our law enforcement. So we have to get control of this. And I applaud the governor for doing that. It's something I strongly support, and I know the president strongly supports it as well.
I'd like to pivot from the economic and fiscal issues to a social issue, something that you voted on recently in the House, and that was the ban on abortions after 20 weeks, the 20-week abortion ban, also known as the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. And this is something that passed at the state level. We have an attorney general who said that he would not defend it if it was challenged in court. Is this something that, now the Senate is considering it, I'm not sure if they have the votes there, but let's say they do pass it. Is this something that could be upheld in the federal courts? Could it withstand a judicial challenge?
I think it could. One of the things that the president doesn't get enough credit for is all the conservative judges that have been confirmed in the last year. One thing that Senator McConnell doesn't get enough credit for is he held up a lot of Obama's judicial nominees, liberal judicial nominees that share none of our conservative values. over the last year of Obama's administration, and we've confirmed hundreds of judges on all the levels, all the way up to the Supreme Court with Gorsuch. Yeah. So I do believe that the court system in America has shifted to the right, which is good for those of us that are pro-life, for those of us that believe marriage is between a man and a woman. And I think that there's been a lot of progress made there. So I'm optimistic that if the Senate will pass the bill that we passed in the House, that I voted for, to ban abortions after 20 weeks, I am confident it can withhold challenges all the way up the federal court system.
So considering the different makeup of the federal courts and this pro-life bill passing, do you see that as emboldening conservatives in the House to pass more pro-life legislation? There's other bills that have been talked about. There's the one issue that has been come up year after year is recognizing human life at conception. I believe it was called the Human Life Act, something along those lines. So do you see the potential for bills like that moving forward as well?
Absolutely. If this bill passes and becomes law, I think that's the first step, and you'll see many more steps. Just with our tax bill, one of the things that's in our tax bills, it allows parents to start college savings accounts for unborn children. Oh. So we recognize birth starts at conception. In our tax bill, you're going to see more and more conservative legislation pass once the Senate passes this 20-week abortion ban and the courts withhold it.
Very good, very good. And I appreciate your pro-life votes and stand as well. We've got just a minute and a half or so to close. I don't know if you want to add maybe some of the challenges. I think that's maybe what we should close on. What are some of the challenges that you see the United States facing, and maybe what you're seeing in Congress?
Well, when the president campaigned about the swamp in Washington, I've been there a year. What I would define as the swamp is the special interests that come in and persuade through through campaign donations, congressmen not to make cuts. Every congressman, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, they have to know that we cannot continue to spend more money than we take in. Yeah. And the reason it's so hard to make budget cuts is elections are so expensive in certain parts of the United States, thankfully not in Kentucky, but the congressmen are beholden to the special interest because they need those campaign donations. To me, we have to do something about campaign finance because if we don't start being more fiscally responsible in America, our children and grandchildren aren't going to have the same opportunities that we had. So my big challenge is trying to get Congress to be fiscally responsible, to operate like you and I operate and your viewers operate. We can't spend more money than we take in our households, and Congress should be the same way. So I'm going to continue to advocate for a balanced budget amendment, and I'm willing to make tough votes to make cuts to try to make our budget balance.
Good. And on that note, we're going to have to leave. But thank you, Congressman Comer, for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.
And best to you.
Thank you.